is my privilege and joy and delight today to kick off this panel conversation about this brand new book, What is Spiritual Care? A question that I'm invited to answer a dozen times a month. It feels like. Most recently, when I was on a plane not too long ago reading this book for this very purpose, in the middle seat, because I hadn't checked into Southwest on time, because I never do, in the middle seat, when you're reading a book like this in the middle seat, someone is going to ask you, so what is spiritual care? And someone did. So this is a question that's an important one not just for our field, but important right now, especially in the context of everything. What does it mean to be about the work of spiritual care, and why does it matter to this project of full humanity at this moment? I'm eager to get into this conversation, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about it other than, as you listen to this conversation this morning, think about it for the content of the questions we're asking. What is spiritual care? I'm sure you have a definition of your own that you're working on. Think about that, write that down, but also think about this in terms of what does it mean to create scholarship at a moment like this? When we talked yesterday in the business session, we talked about how we engage the wider public in a bigger way. What does it mean to create books at this moment? Some sage wrote somewhere in a text, I think in Ecclesiastes, that of the making of books, there is no end. I think I always saw that as a student as kind of a snide comment about the fact that there was always too much reading on the syllabus. But I wonder if it isn't an invitation, right? Or maybe a requirement or a demand that the reworking and reworking and reworking of who we think we are, how we think we are, what we think our call is here in the world is something that we always have to be about, and we always have to be articulating, and we always have to be putting out there, as challenging and difficult, as uncomfortable as it will be. So first of all, to our authors, thank you. Thank you for doing that work, that hard work of distilling your thoughts, grasping for language, and then putting it out there for all of us to ask you questions about. Thank you for that work. It inspires us to do the same. And so let's begin. We're gonna begin today by asking Pam to, because her name is big and large on the front of this book, to say a few things about the book, the project itself, and where it came from. And then I'm going to direct questions up and down to the gathered authors. And what I'm going to ask you to do, authors, instead of reading more of your bios off this page, you have their bios on the page, you can read them too. Instead of reading about you in your presence, when you begin to speak, would you introduce yourself just like with a sentence, maybe something that's not on the bio, but that we should know about you as you contribute to the conversation. Does that make sense? All right. So Pam, would you begin for us? Tell us a bit about this project, and the rest of you queue up in your minds that first question. Locate yourselves with respect to this question. What is spiritual care? What's the importance of the question for you in your context as you think about your work? And then give us your definition. What is spiritual? Okay? But Pam, you first.
Okay. Well, you've seen a lot of me over the last couple of days. So I think the thing I would say more personally is that I love being retired from institutional academia. And so now I do things that are purely labors of love and activism, which in this time seems so incredibly urgent. But being here among these colleagues and my love of IASC, which I was involved in starting 10 years ago, is still very much a part of my heart. And so it's been wonderful to be a part of this gathering and to appreciate so much the work of Dan and Cynthia and Brooke in doing all of the local arrangements. And yeah, so it's a joy to be here and to be among you all again and to see friends and colleagues from abroad, both online and here present. Mahmoud, so glad you got here. So the way, I'll just say, the people on the front cover are not just me. I ended up doing the lion's share of the actual editing of the book once it started to be a manuscript. But Emmanuel Larte and Claudia Colli-Reichenbach and I were on the board when we spawned this project out of the 2 webinars that we held during COVID. And so I need to give credit. Emmanuel was actually the one who sought out and negotiated a contract for the book. And he and Claudia were important sounding boards for me as we, had certain questions that we needed to answer about the direction we were going. And Claudia also helped in the very difficult task of rounding up the people who are in the book. And I should say at the outset, not everyone who presented in those webinars ended up in the book for various reasons. Everyone was invited. Some of them declined to go ahead and turn it into a published article, but they also were very important voices in shaping the whole project. So I'm going to just share with you what I wrote as the preface to explain what the project is about, and then I'm going to conclude with a short excerpt from the epilogue by Ivona Guevara, who by chance, as a friend of a friend, was willing to provide us with a theological epilogue from her location. So what is spiritual care really? Is there a singular definition or praxis? No. Who gets to define it and in what contexts? Historically, chaplains, mostly in hospital settings with fairly uniform training, i.e. clinical pastoral education or CPE, and beginning in the US and Europe, developed the first theological and theoretical foundations, ethics, and normative standards of practice in the mid-1950s to 1980s. And I should note that Paul Tillich was actually one of the well-known figures who was a part of that earliest movement that started CPE. Usually under the umbrella terms pastoral care or Seelsorge. Since its emergence as a religious profession, mostly practiced by ordained clergy and vowed members of religious orders, however, its terminology, ethical and theological underpinnings, normative practices, and range of professional practitioners have all expanded exponentially, even as the civil rights movement, feminist womanist theology and theory, interreligious dialogue, and postmodern and post-colonial theology have challenged the white, mostly Protestant status quo throughout theological education and care of both persons and cultures. There's a vast and growing literature by pastoral theologians and spiritual caregivers over the past half century. Yet fundamental questions of defining pastoral and spiritual care have largely remained implicit as scholars and practitioners have addressed more granular questions of mostly Christian theology, psychology, methodology, theological, theoretical, and practical, social and cultural location, and increasingly identity of caregivers and care recipients, especially since professionals in other clinical professions have begun to recognize their own need to recognize and care for the spiritual needs of patients and clients. Definitions and practices have expanded and at times remained in the silos of their own disciplines. Just in a conversation I had day before yesterday, somebody said they never knew that there was a whole practice and literature of spiritual care in the nursing profession. But there is. Approaches to care have also expanded as the hegemony of Christian pastoral theology has given way to a wider diversity of religious traditions with their differing theological foundations, rituals, and indigenous practices of caring. The individualism of American Protestant care and counseling has been challenged and enhanced by other traditions and cultures' more communal forms of care. And I want to just sort of give a shout out here to Emmanuel Larte, who was one of the pioneers of understanding that both North American, Western, and other cultures approached care from different perspectives, and that there could be dialogue and learning across both ends of that. The present volume represents an international, intercultural, interprofessional, and interreligious project to address these questions. And I'm not going to rehearse things that we said in the business meeting yesterday about the IASC, but that is essentially what our mission is to bring those different perspectives and locations into dialogue with one another. And a whole series of conferences that predated the one that produced this book. The present anthology is a compilation of many of the voices of those scholar practitioners who participated in 2 conferences in 2020 and 2021, which perforce became webinars as the COVID-19 pandemic struck in spring of 2020. Some of the authors here continue to reference the particular challenges and sorrows of spiritual care during those peak years of the epidemic. Their thoughts reflect insights and adjustments to theology and praxis that emerged during those fraught times. These gleanings continue to have relevance to this day as COVID-19 variants still circulate with at times deadly consequences, and certainly more generally as spiritual caregivers continue on the front lines of coping with the impacts of racism, including racial disparities in healthcare, personal and family tragedy, crisis, war, and trauma. And now as we see the withdrawal of USAID from around the world, we are also probably going to see new challenges for spiritual and pastoral care for folks who are now left without resources to cope with a variety of health issues and hunger. So part 1 of the book includes reflections from the professions. So we have medicine, nursing, public health, spiritual care / hospice chaplaincy, and pastoral theology. And part 2 includes Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and Buddhist perspectives. While each author brings a distinctive perspective and represents a particular context, some red threads run through the entire volume. The importance of deep listening, openness to difference, willingness to recognize the importance of spiritual care as practiced by different professions and religious traditions, refraining from religious proselytizing, respect for the inherent dignity of every person, and support for each individual's unique spiritual journey. At the same time, reading all of the chapters taken together, the diversity of voices makes clear, both by juxtaposition and argumentation, that the hegemony of a mid-20th century white American Protestant tradition of pastoral care, which is really only several decades old, is being reevaluated, contested, expanded, and even decolonized as voices formerly from the margins are being brought to the center, and the spiritual needs of persons from many different traditions and locations are increasingly being met on their own terms. We are honored to include an epilogue on spirituality by Brazilian ecofeminist theologian Ivona Guevara, who articulates an overarching assumption of this volume, that spiritual care cannot be divorced from social, political, and economic realities of those for whom we care, and that care is finally inseparable from larger efforts toward justice and peace. Boom. And I want to conclude with a few of her words. She says, "The confusion and violence in our present show that the spirituality of conquest and domination, of imperialism and colonialism that are still present no longer serve us. Women's movements are showing that it is no longer possible to maintain male deities that exclude women and consider them inferior. Ecological movements are showing that the planet needs to be taken care of and that we must no longer open the womb of the earth and remove minerals and oil to enrich a few. We can no longer burn forests because our breath will cease with their ashes. Indigenous people, Black people, and many despised and uprooted peoples have raised their voices to fight against the white hegemony that some religions have wanted and still want to establish in complicity with the dominating empires of this world. A new spirituality intimately linked and blended to our fragile materiality, to our bodies, is slowly sprouting everywhere in the world. The abandonment of gods of power is happening, and their sacred temples and palaces are being replaced by healthy and flowery dwellings of the poor. We are realizing that we will live with dignity if everyone lives with dignity. It is this gentle and constant breeze that has been crossing the world despite the noise of cannons, despite the mass destruction of people and cities, despite the pollution that infests our lives. There is a breeze in the air. There is also a soft singing capable of awakening human tenderness and that can be heard in the early hours of the morning. There is an immense desire to join hands to plant beans and corn, to knead bread, bake it, and distribute it to satisfy different hungers. Today, we are called to breathe this breeze, to seek it every day of our lives, so that we may have life and have it abundantly. John 10:10. Spirituality is the breeze that makes us believe in a possible earthly kinship, in an endless social utopia that always needs to be tried again. Our religious traditions, including our ever-expanding practices of spiritual care, can help us to the extent that we do not make them static truths, dogmas that subject our reason and our hearts to pastimes and ideas that no longer express the richness of what is happening in our lives today. Thank you to Ivona. Thanks.
Thanks, Pam, for that framing and that introduction. I think we'll start at this end of the table. And if you could just tell us, maybe in each of you 3 minutes or so, what is the import in your space, in your context of this question? What's your provisional or your working definition? And how has your understanding of that question changed over time? And introduce yourself just briefly.
Good morning, everybody. I'm good?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be back together. I'm going to start with a definition for what is spiritual care that is at the end of the chapter that I wrote for this book. And it's a definition that I came to contextually. We'll talk more about the content of our chapters in a moment. Before I do, let me tell you, what you know from my bio is that I live in New York City. I did not grow up in New York City. I moved to New York to go to rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary and stayed. New York is an incredibly vibrant place with people from all over the world, every culture you could imagine, and I love being part of that. So here's my definition. As spiritual caregivers, we help people access spiritual sustenance, the protection that comes from being bound up with the divine, even as we face the unknown, even as we transition into the next world, even as we face existential threats. We are not alone. That's my definition. Thinking about the import of this over time, so when I did my first unit of clinical pastoral education starting in 1991 with Sister Teresa Brophy, may her name memory be for a blessing. She gave me a name. I tend to collect names. So the name she gave me was Rabbi on the Margins, because spiritual care was so marginal to the Jewish community at that time. And instead of pretending otherwise, she empowered me on the margins. And that's a name that I carry with me very intensively. And over the last 30 plus years, since I was given that name, I've seen the margins grow closer to the center, or the center expand out to the margins. I was able to create the Center for Pastoral Education at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2009, after I had worked there already for about 7 years in the rabbinical school office. And in that progression, what I saw is that there was a recognition of a need for spiritual care inside the Jewish world, and that my orientation to spiritual care, which was multi-faith, was welcomed. So the center that I created at JTS was a multi-faith center, and recognized that we need each other in this work. And so what I would say, my most important observation about the way that my understanding of what is spiritual care has changed over time is that it has increased in urgency. That the work of sustaining people in the spirit and recognizing the way, especially in my context, that texts understood apart from us are not sufficient. They probably never were, but they weren't always recognized that way. That engagement with the tradition has to be about sustenance in this moment, and that God has to be a full partner in that. And even if we don't understand exactly who God is, that's okay. We still have to be engaged in whatever those efforts need to be to live in this moment. That spiritual care is about helping us to live.
Thank you. Would you please set me down, Dan? Protection. You added a word to spiritual definition that I don't think I've felt but never acknowledged. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Dan Skipani. I'm a jobless, non-retired yet professor of spiritual care, affiliate professor actually here in McCormick Seminary and San Francisco Theological Seminary. And faculty of record for interculturality or intercultural leadership at our seminary, at the Anabaptist Mennonite Seminary in Elkhart, where my title is Emeritus. So,
Can't retire.
well, not yet. I mean, yeah, thank you. It was a wonderful assignment that you gave us, Pam, to zero in and to seek to define spiritual care. And I had a chance to probe and to process a little bit among a number of colleagues some ideas, and I was challenged here and there. So I came up with actually a definition that I'm going to read to you. Fundamentally, meaning, shall I say, universally, spiritual care, compassionate responses to human suffering, broadly speaking, spiritual care as a special way of the process of companioning. And all forms of spiritual care have always consisted in connected wisdom traditions with caregivers, spiritual or existential resources, longings, and struggles in sociocultural and contextually pertinent ways. That is my response here. I could exegete this and take a lot of time, but I want to make a couple of comments. One is this question about spiritual and existential. Since you mentioned Tillich, Tillich has what I found a very helpful way of talking about existential anxiety in The Courage to Be book, in which he explains how chaplains and others involved in spiritual care deal primarily with existential anxieties or spiritual anxieties. They have to do with threats of non-being, threats of meaninglessness, and threats of guilt and condemnation. So I find it helpful, not that it's exhaustive, but it's a way to refer to that which is, one can claim, I do claim, universal actually. We are human because we are spiritual, and being spiritual involves at least forms of searching for meaning, connected in communities, vocation, how shall we live, etc., etc. I can defend this seemingly merely Western way of understanding this because empirically we can actually prove that. So how has this changed through the years? Because my involvements, I started in pastoral counseling and then went to other areas within spiritual care, psychotherapy, and chaplains particularly, and training of chaplains right now, even in Cuba and other places. So I find that this is, for me, this works as such. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you pass the microphone to your friend? You have another one.
This is better.
Okay.
Okay.
Fast. Interreligious microphone. So, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, let me start to answer the question from another point. I was not involved in the web seminars, but I was asked later to write a chapter for this book. And as Claudia asked me, I said, well, this is a big challenge for me because 2019, I get the same question from a German colleague who asked me to write what is the Islamic pastoral care in German, what is Islamic Seelsorge in a pluralistic society. So with this contribution, I get a place and chance with experts to reflect my ideas for 2019. And this maybe it will be answer for your question for yesterday. What is the heart of this association? It gives us place to reflect, give us chance. And I think I just received my copy yesterday. I think if I would read your contribution and others, I will reflect my contribution again. And this is what spiritual care meant for me. It's not closed process. Or as I said in my book, it's the field is still open to design, at least from the Islamic perspective. As I started to think about my contribution, I have maybe 3 challenges. The first one, maybe you know it, I'm coming from another context, from a German context, but maybe the main readers from contribution will be the English speakers. So should I put the German context in my contribution or not? But maybe I will speak in my workshop a little about this later. The second one, we don't have this term in our tradition. We have it as a practice, of course. But But as Schleiermacher, I'm not sure if I can speak from Schleiermacher in a theological onion, it's okay. But Schleiermacher said, practice is not the theology. We need a theory of this. So how can I reflect the practice to design or maybe to define for myself and for others what is my understanding of spiritual care from Islamic perspective, at least to have something to discuss about it. Is that or not? And the third one, going back to my question for 2019, what that means in a pluralistic society. Islamic pastoral care, from my understanding, is maybe a religious supported offers for peoples in need, but it's not designed for only Muslim peoples in need. So how can I do this? This is a sad challenge, is what I write in my contribution. I tried to write on the, not to define what is it, but maybe to characterize which characters are important for me. If I teach this subject, if I talk with my students about experience or the supervision. And I wrote maybe 4 things. Islamic pastoral care can be characterized by 4 aspects: mercy, protection of life, human dignity, and letting oneself be touched by the suffering of others. But this is not all. This closed for me with another questions. How can I find parallel tasks and structure with spiritual care in the pluralistic society? And how can I put the individual in the center of my practice to keep my Muslim identity is important to be still accepted in the Muslim communities, but at the same time, to have a difference to the works of imams in the communities. It's not the same job. And this is a big challenge in the Islamic tradition. What means difference? From my understanding in this contribution, in the works of imams, the religion is in the center. In the work of spiritual caregivers, the person, the human is in the center. So the connection to interreligious, cross-culture, as Pam said, cross-culture and religions, the main idea is how to move the understanding of the tradition from the normativity of religions to humanity of religions. I said it in German, Humanisierungspotenzial. I don't know how can we call it in English. The potential of human being should be in the center and not the normativity of the religion. That was the main questions in my contributions. And if you look to the tradition, and should be the last maybe challenge now on the last point, if we start from the tradition, we find the practice, we find a very rich discourse, that the discourse about connecting between soul and body in Islamic, they are in a unity, not separated from each other. But this discourse is moving in tradition in 3 fields: ethic, medicine, and philosophy. Now I need to create a new discourse, spiritual care discourse. How can I connect this with each other to get a new discourse? If we look to the tradition, the literature today, we find 4 approaches: a systematic theological approach, a virtual ethical approach, a ritual-based approaches, and pragmatic theological approaches, to try to make a theological foundation for this subject. But how can you connect all of them to move to my first point, moving from normativity to humanity of religion? And second point, connected points to another religious and cultures. Because if people are in needs, it don't make different which religion and beliefs they have. And this was, I think, tried to cross my contribution. I think it's, at the moment, I think it's enough at first.
Thank you for that. Pam, go ahead.
Thanks. Since none of our Buddhist contributors are here, can I just add something from that perspective to bring it into the conversation? And I just also, not to put a spotlight on you, Monica, but Monica Sanford is here and was cited by Upayati Larashi, who was the contributor to this volume. And your work has been really, really important in even establishing a framework for an indigenous Buddhist contribution to spiritual care. So thanks for being here. And I just want to read something from Upayati to bring that voice in, because we all represent so-called Abrahamic traditions, but there are non-theistic traditions as well in spiritual care, which brings in a whole different perspective in terms of spirituality. And so Upayati said, mutually generative Buddhist-Christian dialogue will undoubtedly remain a key component of the future of Buddhist pastoral care. If anything, because Buddhist chaplains are, in the US, working in a landscape and culture so deeply architected by Christian paradigms. Robust exchange, collegiality, and solidarity with other religious minorities within the fields of pastoral care will also continue to be critical to the interreligious formation of chaplains. And accredited grassroots Buddhist programs unapologetically rooted in the Buddha Dharma can offer a creative laboratory and a provisional reprieve from the inevitable power imbalances that arise from Buddhists being less than 1% of the population. There has been much discussion about Buddhist chaplaincy, quote, finding its voice. The conversation among Buddhists about chaplaincy and the formation of Buddhist chaplains is far from settled, but its gifts lie perhaps in its inherent and indeed indigenous polyphony. So,
Thank you. Thank you for expanding the table. We are well into the second question I offered to you all via email earlier this week. Because the conversation has become multi-religious and multi-professional, even in our understandings of how we think about spiritual care now, right? Many of you are saying, I had to forge.
Could you use the microphone because we can't
Oh,
hear?
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Is it good?
Thank you. Many of you have had to forge that path to multi-religious ways of thinking about this work. And in so doing, have also deepened your own particularity from your tradition, the wisdom from your tradition. And so I'm going to kind of combine the second and third questions for the sake of time so that we have some time to invite questions from the gathering. Can you talk a little bit, each of you? I think, Mahmoud, you started this out beautifully for us. What is the unique contribution, the distinct contribution of your chapter to this multi-religious, multi-professional engagement? You understand the question? And then Pam mentioned that these were these essays were first kind of crafted for maybe 2020, 2021. Maybe they were revised for this book. We know that that takes time. Where are you going next? What are the challenges? What are the invitations? What are you hearing from each other? As you expand this definition, Mahmoud is right to say this isn't a closed field, right? This is an everything field, and it's always responding. What are you responding to now? Okay. I'm just gonna do the same thing. There we go.
Thank you. So as you witnessed yesterday when I was engaging the subject, I always start with an engagement with Jewish texts. I feel that that's where my voice as a spiritual caregiver comes from in that dialogue. So my chapter is based in text. And the multi-faith piece is that I really feel it's a mistake to function within a silo, any kind of silo, a spiritual care silo and not with other professions, a Jewish silo and not with other faith traditions and no traditions, because something happens when we recognize that we're part of something larger. And as a diaspora Jew, I'm very aware of being a tiny minority inside of a largely Christian culture. So to function Jewishly without awareness of the religions around me is a mistake. My chapter begins with a text that ran through my head during COVID. I first made this presentation in 2020 at Pam's invitation, which was lovely. And the text is a Mishnah, so it's the oldest part of the Talmud. And there are two pieces of it. And one is this idea that every human being is a whole world, olam maleh. And so in COVID, when so many people were dying around me, of course, in the New York City context, just the beginning of COVID was such a devastation, to hold that every death was a whole world and to remember the uniqueness and preciousness of every human being, even in the face of many, many people dying, felt like an important orienting principle. And the other piece from the Mishnah is that Bishvili nivra ha'olam, for me, the world was created, meaning the uniqueness of each person is both the loss when a person dies, but also the opportunity that each of us has to live out our purpose that is a unique purpose. And that language of, for me, the world was created, is so powerful in calling on us to live into what is possible for us to do even when we're feeling powerless. So that's where my chapter begins. I wrote the chapter, so I delivered it in 2020, and I wrote it in October of 2023, just weeks after October 7th, when people had been murdered and raped and taken into captivity. And of course, since then, we've been living with war. So holding on to this principle that every human life is precious is even that much more important in a time of war, when the numbers can feel overwhelming and the conflict can distance us from our commitments. But having that commitment is even more important when we are inside of conflict, to hold on to the desire for hope and the possibilities of peace. And I see spiritual care as playing a very important role there, that we never cut off anyone, whether we are allied or on opposite sides of a conflict, that we still value every human life. And I know that that is so sacred to me, and it puts me in touch with the heartbreak of the death that surrounds us.
To be a person where there are no people. Thanks again for your talk yesterday. I'm not going to say very much because my introduction to the book actually also encapsulates some of what I say as a historian of pastoral theology around some of the changes that happened in the last couple of decades. But one thing I just would add is that, as also a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, I did bring back in my commitment to the idea that human beings are multiple, not singular and homogeneous, and that by attending to the multiplicity of each individual, and I love the idea that each of us is a world, it's very similar, I think, that spiritual care needs to attend to the complexity of each person and not assume that what's being presented on the surface is all there is. That was another thing that I talk about in my chapter. And so my conclusion is that our theories and our theologies and our collegial relationships are all a very important ground. And some things were said about this yesterday in various sessions about the importance of community, that we can't do this work by ourselves, that we need each other and we need the contestation of difference in order to really enrich our practices. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
I have been concerned with, for a long time now, with issues of contextuality and universality. Such as globalization, contextualization, and I have tried to learn to think as dialectically as possible. Anyway, that applies also here in the case of spiritual care, where I keep proposing commonality. If there, because there is commonality, we can be societies that work together and that we interact and that we collaborate, right? So seeking and coming back within the wonderful, beautiful plurality of traditions, what is also that we have in common. What I have found helpful in my own work as a practitioner still and supervisor, etc., and researcher, is wisdom as a concept that I learned first from the scriptures, the biblical contribution here. What is wisdom? How shall we live in the light of God? You know, seek wisdom, understanding. There is something there that then one finds all over. So the question of how shall we live together as humans, and humans in with creation, the environment, etc., right? So I'm very much concerned with issues of, therefore, of normativity. It's impossible to be in spiritual care or in education, pedagogy, without a sense of what is the good community, what is the just community, just world, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that's not given once and for all. We keep reconstructing and together the plurality of voices. So, and yet there is again this dialectic, right? So wisdom as process also, because that's also part of the scriptural background that I work with. In other words, hermeneutics, discernment, how our traditions connect with the longings of people in today and the wisdoms of the clinical psychologists, of course, another wisdom. So it's a wonderful plurality of factors that are then involved. And there are ways, that's the other thing, different ways. Since we mentioned Tillich uses a correlational approach, psychology and theology mediated ontologically, or philosophy. Now, some of us have a different 20 years ago, Ryan Lamotte, who's there, proposed an integrationist approach that is different than that. And there are others, wonderful possibilities. Also, Monica, you yourself have come up with different and complementary, shall we say, approaches that we learn from one another. But there is a core common commitment that I, for one, want to keep at the heart, at the core of our conversations, and certainly me. Finally, I understand integration in threefold ways. I have to be integrated personally. I have to have integration theoretically in my knowings, in my sources, and I have to have integration in my praxis, because there is a plurality of resources that we can employ. And the larger the conversation, the plural, the better, because we draw from each other's resources as well.
Yes, you asked about the next step. Yes, I have 2 steps. The first one, I will introduce myself. I forgot it. I'm Mahmoud Abdallah from Center for Islamic Theology in Tübingen, and we have there the Master of Islamic Practical Theology, the only one in German-speaking areas in Europe. And my teaching, researching field are Islamic pastoral care and interreligious dialogue. And this introduction maybe is important for the answering in the question. I think I spoke about the main idea of my contribution, so I don't need to repeat it again because we don't have enough time. I think I have a special understanding of interreligious cooperation. My understanding is it's not enough to cooperate and to work together and to learn from each other. We should create places and create new knowledge. Also, reproduce of theological knowledge. And in this way, I'm teaching in Tübingen a seminar about intercultural borders as a challenge in the Islamic pastoral care. And the next what I do, I will take this book with me and teach the another contributions and discuss it with my students and reflect again, what is our understanding from Islamic pastoral care? Because for me, it's still open to design, and it will be still open to design. So it will be my next step. Thank you.
So our time is almost at an end. We have, by my incorrect watch, 4 minutes. And how I'd like to spend that 4 minutes is first by inviting these folks who have been faithful and online, and we're here at like 8:35 this morning, some of them. Folks from the global diaspora out there, we don't have time to get answers from the panel, but we have time to hear your questions or your comments. And so I would love to hear if there are questions or comments that come from the group online this morning. Questions, comments? Yes, please, George.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you for the presentations. Interesting topic, but there are several challenges. For me, I'll be very brief. For me, the term spiritual care itself is problematic.
How would you change it?
I don't know. I really do. I don't have any answer, because what is spiritual, we always there is a reference to the transcendent. Can we think about spiritual care without reference to the transcendent being called God, whatever that means? Secondly, there is a concept in one of the philosophies. I totally forgot that. There's a concept in religion. I don't remember exactly, but it's called Anekantavada. That means multiplicity and plurality of concepts. That is in Jain religion. That is one of the foundations of, so they are contradictory, but I think that is the closest I can come to spiritual care. Multiplicity, plurality, but they might be contradictory. The second thing is, I think the panelists try to define what is spiritual care. Even that one is problematic for me because when we try to attempt to define it, we try to limit it. Just like naming God, when Moses asked God in the Bible, Christian Bible, what is your name? I am who I am. When you name somebody, when you define it, we try to limit it. So can spiritual care be limited? So these are the points. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Rest of anyone else online want to chime in? Yes, Carrie.
I really appreciate hearing about struggles of religious leaders who are endorsed by religious organizations that require them to practice certain normative truths that bring them into conflict with the requirements of religious diversity. I just finished a 2-year contract with the Navy, teaching 3-day curriculums to Navy chaplains and their teams, and encountered over and over and over again this just very, very core dilemma of religious leaders ordained and endorsed in traditions that put them at odds with providing spiritual care in religiously diverse contexts. And I encountered many Navy chaplains who struggled with that and resolved it in ways that some of which I thought were very life-giving, some of which I thought were actually profoundly harmful. So it's such a profound struggle right now, I think, for many religious leaders working in religiously diverse contexts.
Yes, thank you. There's a lot of heads nodding yes. Thank you for that contribution. Others online? What about in this room? It's time for break, but I'm going to ask you to leave for break with like questions and comments in your mouths. So speak them in the air so people know who they should migrate towards in this break and what kind of conversation you're going to have.